thank you all for coming this evening. My name is Dr. John Mieczysław. I am the Director of the Polish Institute for Culture and Research here at the Orchard Lake campus. We're very happy to have you all here this evening. And we're very, very happy to have brother guy Consolmagno here, here to speak to us. He received his bachelor's and his master's degree from MIT and his doctorate from University of Arizona. He was appointed Director of the Vatican Observatory in 1993. He is a Jesuit brother since 1991. 1989. And is very well known through his new book, which is When Science Goes Wrong. When Science Goes Wrong, which is probably an entire topic these days, because as a historian, I can point out some historical examples of when science has gone wrong, but is just very well known as a speaker to many different audiences. He's got a YouTube channel and several books. And this evening he's going to be speaking about Nicholas Copernicus and Mikołaj Kopernik, very famous Polish astronomer. This is the 550th anniversary of his birth, so we are celebrating that this year as well. And so with that, lovely guy, welcome to Tweet.
I'm having an Italian name speaking to a Polish audience. I hope you will forgive the foreign accent, but I come from very far away. I grew up in Cranbrook and Maple. And it's wonderful to be back here. And I see a few former U of D High graduates in the audience as well. I want to talk about Copernicus from the point of view of a scientist who appreciates him as a scientist. I'm not a professional historian, I'm not a theologian. I'm someone who loves the history of it, but I depend on other people. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is research that a good friend and colleague of mine, Chris Grady, has done over the last few years. But before I even get into that, I want to start with a short film. And those of you who saw the same film yesterday at Cranbrook, please hold your patience. If you think you get it bad seeing it twice, imagine how many times I've seen this film. Especially because the narrator is somebody who I just can't stand. Of course, yeah. Both science and religion are conversations about the universe. They're ways of learning how we interact with this universe. It's not simply a question of, is there a God, but there is a God, now what do we do? It's not just a question of, there are a bunch of stars, but rather, why are there stars? How do they work? How does that tell us how things work here on Earth? The interaction that I see in my own life is that religion gives me the reason to do the science.
Back in the papacy before Francis was Benedict, and one of his lines in a final elocution to the fathers of the general congregation was, go to the frontiers. Well, there isn't much more frontier than 3.7 billion years away.
The first official interest of the Church for astronomy started in 1582 with the reform of the calendar. Then in 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to have an observatory to show that the Church is not against science, but the Church promotes good science.
They start out by having telescopes on the Tower of the Winds, and then on the walls surrounding the Vatican. As the city lights grow, and as the Italian government gives them back the territory out in Castel Gandolfo, in the 30s they build new telescopes on the roof of the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo, best telescopes of their era in the 1930s. By the 1980s, light pollution makes those telescopes unusable, so we built a new telescope in the dark skies of Arizona.
I'm Father Jean-Baptiste Kikwaya Eluo. I'm working in 3 projects. The first one is NEOS, Near Earth Object. So what I'm doing with NEOS is just observe them using our modern telescope VAT. The second project is meteors. I worked on a very faint meteors, what we call shooting stars. And the third project is set fireball network. They will have 4 cameras here around Tucson so that actually we can monitor any fireball getting into the Earth atmosphere in the region.
This telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, it was the first of the new technology telescopes that has been considered pretty much the norm now in developing telescopes. With the advance of computer technology, we have the capability of bringing that advanced technology directly into our telescope. So it's an expandable, it's almost like it's a living machine, so it can grow as technology grows. It is still very important to maintain scientific research in the Vatican, simply because there is still a lot of confusion about this relationship between science and faith. We are not out here trying to prove the existence of God by looking through a telescope. That's not what we're doing. But we can say that if we want to obtain any reasonable results looking through that telescope, we need to do it embracing a certain work ethics that is, in fact, the same work ethics that the Bible itself tells us through commandments and through the Gospels to embrace.
Human beings look at the stars and wonder. They want to know, what is that? What is that about? How do I fit in? They hear about the moon landing and they want to know, what was that like? If we're part of the human race, we're part of the race that went to the moon. We're part of the species that looked at the stars and wondered, what the heck are those things? Looking at the sky reminds you that there's more to the universe than what's for lunch. What's more, if you believe in a universe that God so loved that he sent his son, then not only are you going to want to study the universe because it's kind of cool, it's an act of worship. It's an act of getting closer to the Creator and getting closer to a universe, as St. Athanasius said 1,500 years ago, was cleansed and quickened by the Incarnation. Then, doing science is an act of worship. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. And it's important to remember when we do astronomy, why we do it. A large part of it is because our understanding of the universe reflects our understanding of ourselves. Copernicus was playing a crucial role in the transformation of one idea of the universe to another. But there have been many such revolutions. Many of you might be familiar with this image of the medieval universe. What you might not know is that it's not a picture of the medieval universe. It's a picture of what people in the 19th century wanted you to believe the medieval universe was. One of the revolutions happened in the 19th century where a lot of really stupid ideas got embedded into the popular culture. As an example, how many people in this room learned that Christopher Columbus proved the world was round? We all learned that. And it's utter nonsense, because number one, everybody knew the world was round, and number two, Columbus didn't prove anything. He didn't even make it around the world. All of this comes out of basically an anti-Catholic, anti-people with vowels at the end of their name kind of culture happening in America at the end of the 19th century. They wanted to keep people like my great-grandfather out of the country. Boy, they were right, you know. Along with that is the mythology that somehow science was opposed to faith. And you can ask yourself, Was there a problem between Copernicus and his faith? We are told that Copernicus correctly described how the planets orbit the sun, but the church opposed him. Actually, no. The church didn't oppose him. The church encouraged him. He wrote his book dedicated to the Pope, encouraged to write it and publish it by a cardinal. And I told him, but it turns out, actually, Copernicus was wrong. Wrong in a scientifically useful way. Because that's one of the other myths we have, the idea that science is, well, somebody were taught science in school. You get the answers in the back of the book and you can pass the course. But science is not a book of answers. That's the boring part. We have to teach people that way, the way that you have to learn the scales before you can play music. But science is all the parts we don't know. The stuff things turned out what we thought we knew was, if not wrong, at least incomplete. And Copernicus's ideas, of course, were incomplete. They were so interesting and so important that people carried on with those ideas and improved them and changed them and developed them further. And that's why he's a great scientist, because people bothered to find out that he was wrong. If you write a paper and 50 years later nobody has corrected it, it means that nobody's right. Indeed, the church did encourage him. Copernicus was a cleric in the church. He was actually nominated to be a bishop at one point. He wrote his initial version of the theory, presented it to Pope Clement VII, and he was so pleased that he was encouraged to continue working on it. In 1533, I believe it is, he presented it in Rome. Cardinal Oniskiewicz writes to Copernicus, urging him to write it out as a complete book. 1543, the book was published, sadly the same year that Copernicus died. If you think that the Copernican theory was radical, opposed by the church, heretical, well, when they did to Galileo, who was, of course, 80 years later, if you think that's what's going on, remember that within 2 years of the publication of the book, the Catholic Church started the Council of Trent, which found heresies of all sorts of places, and never once considered Copernicus. Not because they didn't know about him, but because they saw no reason to think that that idea would be heresy.
The book was banned.
The book was not banned until Galileo made a deal of it, and even then the book was not banned. The book merely had to be corrected only in the parts of Rome that in the Roman Inquisition rules, when Thorn Giebrich checked all of the copies of the Copernican book, he discovered that the vast majority of them actually weren't even corrected. The idea is you cross out the part that says the earth is moving, and you write in, you can calculate pretending the earth is moving. At the Vatican Observatory, we have a copy that the Vatican owned, a pirate edition from 1617, right about this time. Our copy, owned by the Vatican, they never bothered to correct. The book was not banned. In 1619, the book was ordered to be corrected, but most of them nobody ever bothered to do. In order to appreciate scientifically what the book meant, we go back to an ancient cosmology. This is the cosmology that you might be familiar with from Genesis, where the earth is on pillars, it's on a foundation, there's a dome over the earth and water above and below the dome. This is actually not biblical, this is Babylonian. Chapter 1 of Genesis was written by Jewish scholars in Babylon who adopted the best science of the day. But of course, we all know the best science of the day today is going to be obsolete tomorrow, which is why it's a lousy thing to base your religion on. They said, okay, everybody knows this is how science is made, but the Babylonians had their version of it. The world was made by accident. What we're seeing here is the dead body of a dragon that was killed in a big fight with the various gods. And by accident, human beings were formed, but sneakily they gathered together and created the best thing the human race will ever do, the city of Babylon. The end. And the Hebrew scholars said, no, this may be what the world looks like. I mean, it sure looks like what it looks like. And see the dome out the window. You know, the dome going all the way to the ground there. And I could see the rain and the snow coming out of the sky, so there must be chambers up there that are holding it. Very logical. Not a bad first guess. Wrong, but like most science that's wrong in interesting ways. And the Hebrew scholars said, no, this is not an accident. In the beginning, God is already there. Before there is space, before there is time. God is not part of the universe. That means that God is supernatural. And supernatural doesn't just mean, you know, like Casper the Friendly Ghost. If there was a Casper the Friendly Ghost, that was simply part of nature. That could not be supernatural. Supernatural means outside of space and time. And that's important to the human race because, as Wittgenstein put it, a chair only has meaning because there's something not chair that gives it meaning. The universe only can have meaning if there is something not universe that can give it meaning. Our existence has meaning because of a God who is not part of the universe. The first thing God does in Scripture is to say, let there be light, and nothing's hidden. Nothing is, known only to the gods. The universe is made in a logical way that if its logic is day follows night. And every step along the way, God says, this is good. Actually, what he says, unfold is, yeah, that works. And the goal of creation, the ultimate point of the 7 days of creation, is the seventh day, which is the day of rest, which is where we are invited to not worry about what we're going to do to feed ourselves, but to feed our souls, to contemplate the universe, the creation, and the Creator. So that we are made to be astronomers, and poets, and artists, and all the other things that make us more than just well-fed cows. That, they say, was the best science of the day in Babylon about 600 BC. Within 100 years, people had finally worked out that the world was round. Among other things, you can see the shadow of the world on the moon during the lunar eclipse, and it's round. You can see it. What's more, you can actually even measure it by seeing on the longest day of the year, a column of light in Egypt goes, Syene goes straight down a well, but if you go 1,000 cubits to the north, you can see a shadow. And by the length of the shadow, you can calculate the radius of the earth, and you get it right. It's not a bad calculation. The next idea, of course, was that the earth is the center of things, and then the rest of the universe is somehow outside of it. And again, that's an observation that anyone can make going out at night, assuming you can see its stars. Cosmology would have probably not progressed so quickly if everybody lives in Michigan. Aristotle worked out 4 forms of matter. He called them elements, we call them phases: solid, liquid, gas, plasma. And he said solid has a natural place at the bottom of the universe. Water sits on top of the rock. Air sits on top of the water. Fire sits on top of the air. And if you've ever seen a rock fall through water, you see it's going to its natural place. If you see bubbles going up through water, it's going to its natural place. If you see a flame rising up, you see it going to its natural place. Based on observations, quite logical observations. This is the universe. Notice, in this universe, the earth is not the center, but the bottom. The dregs of the universe. In fact, it's described in some ancient writings as the sewage of the universe. And Dante puts it this way: the only thing worse than the earth is the center of the earth, where the inferno is. Why do we know that the inferno is in the center of the earth? I can take you to an island off the coast of Italy called Vulcano, where you can see the fiery brimstone for yourself if you don't believe it. All based on observation. All very logical. There's one odd thing about this picture, though. The amount of air in the universe covers the entire world, and certainly goes up higher than anybody can reach. There's a heck of a lot of air. And the earth is pretty darn big. And the fire above the air is going all the way out to where the moon is. That's an enormous amount of material. How come we only have a little bit of water? Is this logical? Or does it assume that there ought to be a whole lot more water? Indeed, enough water that it ought to completely cover the earth to an enormous depth. The people who were looking at the world made a globe of it, made maps of it. This dates from about 20 years before before Columbus, so 100 years before Copernicus. And you can see a continent on one side and nothing but water on the other. And this is because they understood what happened to all that water. After all, in Genesis, we're told the waters are under the heavens, they're gathered together in one place, and the dry land appears. And so it was done because God made it happen. Now, mind you, this was written before the Aristotelian idea of layers of water, so the regular Genesis really wasn't talking about what they think it was talking about. But they happily said, okay, we've got the earth, we've got the water, we're going to drag the water off to the side, leaving the dry land on one side and having the force of God holding off the water so it doesn't cover the land. And notice, after you leave the shore, the water gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and farther and farther and farther away from the center of the universe, the center of the land. It's twisted around this way. If you've got a boat sailing away from the land, it must be sailing uphill. That's why they call it the high seas. That's why it's high. Well, you can test this. You can go to the shoreline where there's nothing but an ocean as far as the eye can see. And with a telescope, or even just a tube, level it out so that it is perfectly level. And when you do that, you discover that the horizon is a little bit higher than straight ahead. You can see the high seas. So observation is telling you this is what's happening. Well, I mean, you can see the high seas. Well, actually what we're seeing is the refraction of the air, making the water look like it's higher than where it is. But they didn't know that back then. Not only that, but what's the center of the dry land likely to be? Well, the most important place on earth, the city of Jerusalem. It all makes lovely, perfectly normal, logical sense. Unless you have this crazy idea that the earth is spinning, and then you've got this enormous bulge of water that you have to swish around, thus saying that this is ridiculous. The idea that the earth is spinning. Everybody knows the earth can't possibly be spinning, because how would you handle all of that water that you're trying to swish around? If you think this is kind of crazy and I'm making this all up, you can see images dating from that era as late as the 1600s, 150 years after Columbus. This is, of course, why Columbus thinks that he can go and find Asia by sailing around the world. Because he knows there couldn't possibly be any land after you leave Spain until you get to Asia, because it keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper. What Columbus, of course, also did was to miscalculate how big the world was. When people told him, don't go, it's not because they thought that, he was going to fall off the edge of the earth, but rather his ships were going to run out of food before they got to the other side, which is exactly what would have happened if he hadn't run into the Americas first. What's worse, this idea is used as a proof of the existence of God. The fact that the water is higher than the land can only occur because there's a supernatural God holding the water back. And this is as late as 1777. People are making this crazy argument. Okay, I think we can all see it's a crazy argument. But I hope we can see that there is some logic to it. It made sense in terms of the Aristotelian physics that people had grown up with. It made sense in the idea that it does seem that the water is going uphill, sort of. Now, the idea that Jerusalem is the center of the world, if you do a mathematical mapping on all of the dry land, including the Americas, you discover that the center is actually not all that far from Jerusalem. But what's fascinating is that when Columbus assumed this was true and would be able to go around and wound up instead finding the Americas, and the nature of the Americas were understood, people realized if there could be a continent over there, then the water was not getting thicker and thicker, and maybe this entire theory was wrong. And with this theory going wrong, the idea that the earth could spin suddenly became reasonable. And in fact, if you read Book 1, Chapters 2 and 3 of Copernicus's book, he goes into great length talking about this. Or at least so Chris Crane tells me, because Chris has done that. I haven't. Most of us haven't bothered to slog through all of Copernicus's book. But I guess it's probably worth doing. Chris is, one of our colleagues and has found all sorts of wonderful things in the history of science by reading books that everybody talks about but nobody has ever read. To quote, this is Chris's translation, we should not heed claims that the water is 10 times the volume of the land or that the land bulges out. And indeed, when you look at the shape of the earth in an eclipse, you don't see that bulge. So they kind of should have known that. Nonetheless, that still leaves the earth at the bottom of the universe, with all of the planets and spheres going around it. And this fits not only what you can see by looking out at the sky, it fit the idea of the order of the universe. And the edge, the firmament, is where God lives, and there are these concentric spheres, each moving independent of the other. Now, here on Earth, if something is moving, either it's trying to get to its natural place by going up or down. If it moves side to side, it must be alive. Well, what about trees? Trees are moved by the wind. What's the wind? It's a breath. The earth is somehow alive. Or maybe there are spirits in the trees that are moving back and forth, causing the wind. What about rivers? Well, there are deities living in the rivers. What about the planets? Well, there must be intelligences living in the planets. When this idea is Christianized, it becomes the ranks of angels. The cherubim, the seraphim, the thrones, the dominions, the powers. And if you have, where is that coming from? You can read about them in St. Paul. But St. Paul has an interesting thing to say about them. I mean, the pre-medieval, the Greek and the Roman world had these run by deities with little demons that would throw messages back and forth that we could call demons or we could call genies. And among the messages are the things that made astrology work. So that if you were born when the demon of music was there, you would have the little splash or a little bit of music in you. They also can give you bad things. If you were born under a bad influence, because of the evil star that showed up in the wintertime to give you influenza. What does the word influenza mean? It's the Italian for influence. You're under the influence of the evil winter sky. That's why you're sick. And so, to overturn the idea of these spheres is to overturn not only the astronomy, but your entire sense of who you are and how you fit into the universe. And incidentally, going back to what St. Paul was saying, what he is saying is, forget about all these demons and all these geniuses, none that they don't exist, but that Jesus Christ is greater than them. That he is the mediator between us and the divine. We don't need to perpetuate all these other demons and geniuses and whatever there is in the sky. The only trouble with this picture is that when you actually look at the motions of the planets moving through the sky, it doesn't quite work. If you observe planet Mars against the stars, and then you go 10 days later, it is moved by one spot. And you go 10 days later, it is moved by one spot relative to the stars. And it moves and moves and moves and moves, and then it starts going backwards. So, and not only that, but it goes up a little bit, and then it goes down a little bit. Are those spheres somehow reversing themselves? Well, Eudoxus had a much cleverer idea. The spheres are inside other spheres, and they're all turning at different rates, such that, well, that just means there's more demons out there that we have to pay attention to. By the 150 AD, Ptolemy had a much more interesting way of describing it. He said, basically, the planets are orbiting, let's see, the Earth in circles, but each of the planets' orbit has its own circle. And sometimes there would be a circle around a circle. But essentially, that was, that curlicule is the actual path of the planet. In a simplified form, the more circles you have, the more curlicules you have, the more you can match the motion of the planet. That was the situation when Copernicus came along. This is the image of the Copernican system that you find in the beginning of his book. He did not make this image. He was not around when the book was actually published. This was put in by the publisher to give you kind of an idea of kind of what he was talking about, kind of. This is actually what he was talking about. Because he still had circular orbits, and he still had these epicycles, and indeed, he still had them moving in circles that were not necessarily exactly on the sun, but offset from the sun. The difference was simply that the sun was there at the center, or close to the center, and the one term that you found in every calculation for planetary orbits could be eliminated. So we made the calculation that much easier. And that's why a lot of people would say, oh, this was a better calculating device. And other people would say, no, this is actually what the universe is. Is the sun actually in the center, making a little circular motion around the true center? Or is this merely an easy way of calculating things? Notice that both systems have the same result. The Copernican system can explain the backwards and forwards by having the planet inside moving faster than the planet outside. So as it overtakes the planet on the planet on the outside looks like it's going backwards. And then as it curves away, it looks like it's going forward again. The great thing about the Ptolemaic system was that if you don't exactly match the position of the planet in one epicycle, you can add a second epicycle inside the epicycle. And if that doesn't work, you can add a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. And in this way, you can match any possible orbit. Indeed, by having circles within circles within circles, you can trace out any kind of path you can imagine. Modern mathematicians recognize this as a Fourier series. It's an infinite number of sines and cosines. If you don't believe me, in your spare time, go to YouTube, type in Ptolemy epicycles Homer Simpson. And this guy has worked out the mathematics and traced out the orbit of Homer Simpson. The bad part of the Ptolemaic system is that it is so flexible that it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you anything about the forces that actually cause the planets to move. So it's incredibly precise, but it's also sterile. And we'll come back to that. At the very least, the Copernican system is a little bit easier to calculate. But how can we tell whether or not it's the Earth or the Moon moving? People back then were very clever, very good mathematicians, and they understood there is a very straightforward way to prove whether or not the Earth is moving. And it's called parallax. If the Earth is one side of the Sun, a nearby star would seem to be in front of more distant stars. 6 months later, it would appear to have shifted compared to those different stars. No one had ever been able to see any such shift. Galileo looked for it tremendously even with a telescope and could not see it. Before him, Tycho Brahe didn't have a telescope, but he had an 18-foot protractor and was able to measure angles to a remarkably high precision, and he could not see any such parallax. So if you can't see any parallax, and the stars are nearby, then the Earth can't be moving. If the Earth is actually moving, then the stars must be very far away. So, how big are the stars? How far away are the stars? Again, those of you who heard my talk yesterday, I apologize for repeating myself, but this is a cute little story. How do you know how far away a star is? Nowadays, we do it because we actually have been able to measure the parallax. 300 degrees, 360 degrees in a circle, right? Why is it 360 degrees? Because there's 360 days a year. It's actually 365, but then it doesn't divide evenly. 360 divides really well, so they decided to make the circle 360 rather than 365. Every degree, which is a pretty small thing, can be divided into 60 minute parts. Why 60? Because it can be divided by 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So, every minute part or minute can be divided into a second set of minute parts, or a second. If you saw a parallax shift of 1 second of arc in the position of a star, we would say that that star had a distance from us of 1 parsec, which is a unit of distance, not a unit of time. Thank you, Consolmagno. The nearest star is 2.5 parsecs away. The nearest star has a shift of less than a second of arc. It took really precise measurements with really big telescopes in the 19th century to finally make these measurements. But people are very clever, and they thought they could come up with a very clever way of estimating how far away the star is. Any star. And the idea is to make a few reasonable assumptions. Let's say that all the stars are suns. This was not a radical idea that Giordano Bruno invented and got burned at the stake for. This was an idea that had been around for a long time. Nicholas Mkusim talks about this 200 years before Giordano Bruno, and he was a criminal. You know, maybe Bruno got burned at the stake for plagiarism. If you know that every star is a sun, then you look at a star through your telescope and you see it as a disk. And you work out how big is that disk compared to the disk of the sun, And then by geometry, that's how more far away it is than the sun is from the Earth. Galileo did this. And he worked out that it was 2,000 times farther away, a typical 6th magnitude star. And brighter stars would be even closer, if you claim, which is why I made it bright. And then you can read the whole thing then. That meant that the stars are pretty close, which meant that you ought to be able to see parallax. But nobody saw parallax. First of all, let's figure out why it is that these people got it wrong. What do we know that they didn't know? We know that light comes to us through our telescopes as waves. Now we got a lake out there, and if you built a little harbor with water, the waves of the lake hitting the harbor walls, once the sun goes through the harbor gap, they don't look like that. The waves don't just suddenly stop at one side or another. They bend around. They spread out. The narrower the gap, the more they spread. And you can actually see this in a laboratory. This is a shadow table of what we need to the interference patterns. You make the thing smaller, that it spreads out all the more. That's what's happening with the telescope. All the light is going through that hole in the front. You notice that hole in the front is kind of small. Galileo was really clever and blocked off most of the light hitting the lens because his lenses were spherical, not parabolic. And so they were kind of fuzzy unless he squinted them down like that. He made the telescope look sharper, but he also made the fuzziness bigger. The smaller the hole, the bigger the fuzziness. We call this an Airy disk today, after George Airy, who worked down in the 1830s. So, 200 years after Galileo, 300 years after Copernicus. The amount of brightness across the disk goes from 0 at the edge to a maximum at the top at the side, and then 0 at the other end. And that's what it looks like. If you have another star, which is a point source which should not show any disk, if you have a second star, the width of its light is going to be exactly the same because that's controlled by the geometry of the telescope. But the height will only be half as high because it's only got half as much light coming at it. Everybody with me this one? More or less? I'll show you it won't be. Here's the last goofy thing. The human eye is not perfect. It can't see infinitesimally faint things. There's a cutoff as to how faint it can see. So let's eliminate the faint part. Then now you see that the brighter star will have a bigger fuzzy spot compared to the fainter star. You can even see this in photographs. Now, Galileo and Copernicus before him, and then T. O'Brien in between them, all understood that some stars are brighter than others, but they interpreted that as being bigger than others. Because that's what they saw in the telescope. The brighter the star, the bigger the disk. And hey, if stars are brighter because they're closer to us, they would look bigger. So this exactly fits what they expected to see. Best science of the day. Wrong, but best science of the day. It turns out, 300 years worth of hard work later, we've actually been able to measure with that parallax and the very careful measurements, the distances to lots of stars in our neighborhood. If you look at the 100 stars closest to Earth, 80 of them are so faint you cannot see them with the naked eye. If you look at the 20 brightest stars, the first magnitude stars, most of them are way far away from us. It just happens that most stars are not suns. Most stars are a lot smaller than the sun, but some stars are a whole lot bigger and brighter. So the whole assumption that went into this calculation turns out to be wrong. It was a reasonable assumption. It was a first good guess, but it's not how the universe works. But they didn't know that. There was no way they could know that. And the only thing they could have done at the time was to start with a simple assumption and see and push it until it shows up to be wrong, which is what eventually they did, which is how we know that it was wrong. But Sean, there are very clever people who say, I don't see any parallax. Well, if the stars are nearby, then the Earth isn't moving. If the Earth is moving, the stars are very far away. If the stars are like our sun, but they have the sizes that we see in the telescopes, then they are nearby, and therefore the Earth is not moving, and therefore Copernicus is wrong. That seems to be the logical conclusion. Unless we resolve ourselves of one of those assumptions. If the stars are still really far away, which is what we need for the Earth to be able to move, then the stars have to be enormously bigger than the sun. Or we're seeing fuzzy dots, but they still hadn't come up with the idea of fuzzy dots yet. Instead, they came up with the idea that stars are mostly enormous, bigger than the solar system, certainly bigger than the orbit of the Earth, and very far away. If they're that big but really far away, they're probably very faint. I mean, think of it. If I think I know how big a star is, and I add all the stars in the sky and glob them together with the size that I think they have, it would be about a third the size of the moon. But all the stars in the sky put together don't give us as much brightness as the moon does, or even a third of the moon. Therefore, the stars must be enormous and far away and very dim, and therefore very, very different from the sun. What crazy guy believed that? Nick and Alan Cabot. People whom, we hold up as giants, the idea. Every single star exceeds not only the Earth, but also the sun, and jumping the whole orbit of the Earth. Now, of course, today we say that's a ridiculous idea, except that actually there are red giants out there that actually are that big and relatively faint. Betelgeuse being an example. And yet, this doesn't explain whether or not the Earth moves. Tycho Brahe thought that those are the relative sizes of the planets and of the stars, and Tycho Brahe didn't think that the Earth was moving. In order for the Earth to move, a Copernican star would have to be that big that big compared to the sun and the solar system. If the Earth is not moving, then how do you explain the other motions of the stars that Copernicus got so brilliantly right? Tycho Brahe had a clever solution. The Earth is at the center. We know that compared to the background stars. We know that because we don't see the stars moving, and we don't believe that those are ginormous stars. It's crazy, says Tycho. The sun is going around the Earth, because that's the only way we could have it work, and all the planets go around the sun going around the Earth. And if you're just looking at the motions of the planets, the way that Galileo did, this is exactly the same as the Copernican system. It was just a shift in origin. Only it doesn't have the stars moving, and therefore the stars can appear to not shift as the Earth moves. This was the answer that solved all the problems of the 17th century. Of course, we now know it's wrong. But it solved the problems better than any other answer at the time. And that's what science does. It keeps coming up with wrong answers that are better than the previous wrong answers. But give a lot of room for us guys at the frontier to show those are wrong, and we've got newer and cleverer wrong answers. One of the right answers that Kepler came up with was the idea that the planets are moving around the sun in ellipses. Why did Kepler decide that ellipses were better than circles and epicycles? It was based entirely on a philosophical point. Kepler believed that the sun was the center of the universe, not just the solar system, the universe. He's 100 years after Copernicus. He's right, Copernicus. He's convinced that Copernicus is right and the sun is at the center because, this is of course 1700, and lots of creative theologies going around. Kepler's creative theology is this. He explains it in a letter to a buddy of his. Heard about von Herringberg, and I'm getting this from a book written by a Jesuit who was actually able to plow through Kepler's really tedious Latin. Maybe it helps that the Jesuit in charge was not himself a Westerner but an Indian, and so the Latin didn't phase him quite as much. Job Karandaran, so a name like that, he could handle any gift word. He was also the guy who taught people how to see the science in Chicago. Anyway, to quote his book, Kepler writes to his buddy, the center of anything is the origin and beginning of anything, like his theory. Indeed, the origin has a precedence everywhere, and is by nature always first. Now, we've got this universe. The whole idea was that God was out in the peripheries. No. God is in the center of the universe. We apply this to the idea of the most holy Trinity. The center must refer to the image of God the Father. Hence, the center of this material world sphere should be adorned by the most ornate body in the universe, namely the sun. The light coming off the sun is the Holy Spirit, by the way. And the sphere we are is the sun, S-U-N. The sphere we are is the sun, S-O-N. Kepler came up with this utterly goofy theology, and as a result of it, believed not only that the Copernican system sort of was right, but that his vision of the Copernican system was better because it got rid of the Ptolemaic system, and it also got rid of that little circular dance that the sun had to do when Copernicus was still using perfect circles. Instead, he found that if he put the sun at the focus of an ellipse, then the sun didn't have to move, and every planet would have a different ellipse using the same focus. And that's what we believe today. On the other hand, as it happens, each planet will slightly perturb the other planets. So the orbits are not perfect ellipses. We know that because of the perturbations. Kepler didn't know that. If Kepler used data that was one decimal point more precise, he would have seen that the ellipses were not perfect, and he probably would have thrown out the entire theory. Given ellipses, Newton was able to come up with this law of gravity, because his law of gravity predicts that orbiting bodies should orbit in ellipses, not perfect circles. All that stuff you learned about orbits in freshman physics is simplified, shall we say. The real now, it's a real pain. You wouldn't want to have to do it as a pressure. But notice something interesting here. Ptolemy would be able to perfectly predict the orbit of any body perturbed by any other body to the extent that it was perturbed into a picture of Homer Simpson. Kepler couldn't do that. Ptolemy was more precise. It was more correct. And it was sterile. Kepler, with the theory that was almost right, gives rise to the theory of gravity. This is also how science proceeds in ways that they never tell you about the classroom. That being kind of close is sometimes better than being 100% close. That there are times when you want to, take off your glasses and see the general shape rather than being lost in each of the trees in the forest. And remember now there was this Newton and the whole point of that. What does it have to tell us about faith? I promised, and most of this is Copernicus and his science, but I promised a little bit about faith. Science doesn't deal with proofs. It's always open to correction and revision. That's why I still have a job. That's why I'll still ask for more money to do more things. That's why I'm proud to say that papers that I wrote 50 years ago are wrong. Because it means they were interesting enough that people were able to find what was wrong with them. Both faith and science can grow only when we admit that our understanding is not perfect. Opposite is true of science. I've demonstrated that. But recognize that's also true of your friend. If you think you are perfect, you're going to stop working and trying to get no kind about it. But your relationship with God is the same as my relationship with the universe. It's not the microphone. I apologize for who's ever recording, not as a big one there. Our relationship to God should be like my relationship to the universe. I love it. That's why I spend the time with it. Those of you who have found somebody to love, I hope you don't think that your knowledge of that person is perfect. I hope you don't think that you've got it all solved. I know her is all in the back of the book. Yeah, right. Our relationship of love is one that continues to grow. You continue to learn about each other. What the heck? You keep changing. You better keep learning. That's the relationship that we have to have, both with our God and with our universe. A relationship where we want to keep learning and growing and correcting and enriching and adding more detail. What Copernicus did was revolutionary. In a sense, he gave meaning to the idea of a revolution, things turning around. More than one cosmology can be possible to explain a given set of observations. Just because the cosmology works for what you know, it doesn't mean it's true. But which cosmology you choose depends on all sorts of assumptions and urges. Oh, it's got to be circles because circles are perfect. Oh, it's got to be that the sun is at the center because it makes God more elegant. And we all do that. And that's okay. Some of these urges could be out of our sense of what our religion teaches us, whether the religion really teaches that or not. So it could be, hey, if I say this, I'll get the money to keep doing my work. All of these things affect what scientists do because, sadly enough, scientists are human beings. Or more gloriously of all, scientists are human beings with all the urges that make us want to do it and want to keep going and want to, in some cases, show the other guy was wrong or at least show that I was wrong before the other guy tells me I was wrong. What we find in common is the sense that anything that survives a change in the culture must have something that supersedes that culture. It's not just a matter of who gets the last laugh, like it says there. But if there are things that we can continue to gain great truth out of, even as our cosmology changes, then these are truths that somehow are universal and ultimate. I think in our religion, if we can find in our religion beliefs that survive even as we go from the Babylonian to the Greek to the Copernican to the modern cosmology, then these are ideas that are going to survive. And that's comforting as well as challenging. Thank you everybody for coming. And you want to know more about the observatory or more articles that you can find on my website, go to VaticanObservatory.org. Thanks a bunch, and thank you.